Hello and welcome. My name is Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant psychiatrist working in private practice in Harley Street. And I'm delighted to be joined now by Claire Greaves. She's a 22-year-old young woman who's had a lot of experiences with the mental health services system here in the United Kingdom. So Claire, let's go back right to the beginning of when it all started. And you were at primary school and your dad developed quite a severe disorder that was linked to do with eating, and this affected your attitude to eating. Tell us a bit about what happened.
Well, I saw my dad unwell, and I saw that food was making him unwell, and I became worried that food would make me unwell, so I started to avoid food and become anxious around food and worried that it would make me ill, and that's where the anxieties with food began.
And also you were a bit of a perfectionist, and you didn't like getting questions wrong, and this seemed to lead to quite a severe reaction. Tell us about what happened there as well.
If I got a question wrong at school, I would get quite upset, and it'd lead to self-harming behaviours. So I'd be in the toilets, like banging my head against the wall. I used to get quite distressed if I got anything wrong.
And you spent most of your life at secondary school kind of throwing away food and hiding your self-harm. Tell us a bit about how things got a bit worse at school.
I think my relationship with food became about coping with issues as I grew up and bad things happened to me, and just general teenage stuff as well. Food became like my coping strategy and my control, so I would throw the food away or I would self-harm, and it was almost punishment or coping with things, and it just became about different things then.
Then you became quite anorexic and you were surviving only on a Diet Coke a day, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And basically you woke up one Saturday morning overwhelmed by sadness and self-hatred, unable to speak to your family, and you kind of just wanted to be dead. Tell us a bit about what that was like.
Yeah, I woke up one day and I just couldn't stand myself. I didn't want to be in my body. I felt disgusted by the way I looked and who I was, and my body image was just horrific. And I just felt like there was no other option than to die because things just felt so bad.
I think then you took an overdose. So is that the first time you ended up in a hospital?
Yeah, that's right.
Tell us a bit about what happened there, the overdose, and how you connected with mental health services.
Well, I'd been unwell for a while leading up to it, and I had to leave my dance college, and I didn't deal with that very well at all, so my anorexia got a lot worse, and I was a low weight, and I took an overdose because I didn't know what else to do, and I'd been to my GP like the same week, and he hadn't put a referral into any services. He'd said see you in a month, and I didn't know that I could last a month, and so I took the overdose and ended up in the hospital.
But how did you end up in the hospital?
My friend at the time knew that things weren't okay, and she texted me and become concerned, and she came to visit me, and she could tell that I'd taken something, so she drove me up to the hospital.
It's interesting because there's a pattern that's going to develop, and it starts here, where people who aren't professionals or clinicians seem to be the ones that appear most helpful throughout your story. And this is the beginning of it, in a way. It was a non-clinician that intervened.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
So you ended up in hospital, and what happened then?
I was treated for my physical health problems, and I was assessed by CAMS, and then sent home, and I had to wait for the referral to go through to the eating disorder service.
But that took a long time. There was some administrative problem at that stage.
Yeah, that's right. It took a while.
But it took a long while. There were many months waiting. Was that right for a referral?
Yeah, I was left waiting many months.
How much were you weighing at this stage?
I think I was around 5 stone 9.
Okay, right. But there were other aspects of the anorexia. You got into you developed a laxative addiction, and you got into binge eating. Tell us a bit more about how this was showing itself, this severe anorexia.
Well, once I had hit quite a low weight, I did see one eating disorder service, and the funding got cut, so I had to stop my treatment with them, and go on a waiting list for another one, which took 18 months. And my anorexia, I tried to recover from it on my own, but it turned into binge eating, and then the binge eating turned into laxatives, and I was caught up in this cycle where I was binging, I was like fasting, I was taking 20 laxatives a day, and yeah, everything was about my eating disorder. Every waking hour was eating disorder.
You then got very depressed, and at this stage you get admitted to a psychiatric ward. Tell us a bit about that and what the ward was like.
Um, the ward was like, it was quite scary to be on. Um, it was quite far from my home, and I had to share a room, which isn't like, when you're feeling so bad, it can be quite hard to share a room with a stranger. Um,
Okay. And tell us a bit more about what happened, because at this stage is about the time you get sectioned under the Mental Health Act for the first time.
yeah, so I left the ward because I became scared I was going to gain weight on the ward, as they were encouraging me to eat like cheese sandwiches, and so I made out I was fine and I went back home. And then it must have been probably like 6 days later, my college became concerned because I was back in education then, and they became concerned that I was still unwell, and they called the police, and I was detained under a section 136.
Okay. You mentioned CAMS earlier. CAMS are Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. Then you mentioned the Section 136. This is a section of the Mental Health Act where a policeman who finds a person in a place that the public have access to, like on the street, can place someone under a temporary section of the Mental Health Act. Could you tell us a bit about what actually happened there with the police?
Well, it was college policy to call the police if they were worried that someone was suicidal. So the police arrived and they asked if I was willing to go into hospital, and I said yes, I was. And they weren't going to detain me under Section 136, they were just going to sort out me going back into hospital. But the hospital wouldn't allow it to go that way, so they were left with no choice but to detain me under Section 136. And they tried to find like a place of safety, like a Section 136 suite, but there weren't any available. So they were left with no choice but to take me to a cell.
This is a police cell in a police station.
Yeah, that's right.
So you ended up there despite the fact you hadn't broken the law, simply because there were no beds in the mental health system. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
So what was it like being in a police cell? I mean, how old were you at this stage?
I was 19 at this point.
Okay, you'd never been in a police station before, I imagine.
No, I had never stepped foot in a police station. It was absolutely terrifying.
Okay, tell us a bit more about what happened.
So I was taken in the entrance that you would be taken in if you had committed a crime. I was taken up to the desk, and I was so scared that I would do something wrong because there were signs everywhere like saying don't step over this sign, and I was so scared of doing something wrong. And they ordered a strip search, so I was strip searched in a cell. It was a Friday night as well, so it was loud. There were people shouting, people kicking off, people getting restrained. Yeah, it wasn't like the right place to be in when you're so distressed.
And what kind of distress had you been in before the Section 136?
I was very low in mood, struggling with depression a lot. I felt very suicidal, and that day I had actually binged and taken 40 laxatives, so I was physically not well either.
Right, so really, you should have been in a place where you could have been looked after medically, but you ended up in a police cell because there were no mental health beds. Tell us a bit more about what happened in that cell. How long were you there for, and what happened to get you out of there?
I was in the cell for 10 hours, and then a doctor came to assess me, and we decided that I would go back into hospital as a voluntary patient.
And is that what happened?
Yeah, that's right, that's what happened.
Okay, and how long were you in the hospital for, and what was that like?
I was in hospital for 3 weeks. It wasn't particularly helpful. because there was still no aftercare. Like, I needed a lot of support when I got home. And also the staff didn't have time to work with the patients as much as some of the patients needed help. And there wasn't an OT, so there were no activities to do on the ward. It was a lot of just like sitting on your bed and waiting around. It wasn't particularly helpful.
What was it like in terms of the other people who were there, the other clients or patients or users of mental health services that were there?
Um, Everyone was like, I wasn't scared to be around people. People were fine, but it was kind of a lot like other patients were supporting other patients because the staff didn't have the time. So you would find that patients would be talking to you about their problems, and it was a bit uncomfortable in that way.
Did you ever feel threatened?
No.
And what about relatives or friends visiting you? What was that like? Was that allowed?
It was allowed, but because it was quite far away from where I lived, I didn't have many visitors. I think I had one friend come and see me and my parents come to see me, and that was it.
How far away was it from where you live?
It was about a 45-minute drive.
And again, was that partly because of the problem to do with beds? They were trying to find a bed for you somewhere?
No, that's just to do with funding, because we lived on the border of the county, so we had to travel quite far for any hospital.
Okay, so you managed to get out of there eventually, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, how long were you in there for?
3 weeks.
And then what happened in terms of treatment?
Well, I was sent home with a care coordinator to support me, but unfortunately she went on sick leave, so I didn't see anyone for about 2 months after I come out of hospital, so I was dealing with it all on my own again.
Okay, and what was that like?
It was really hard because I did want to get better and I wanted to stay positive, but it can be very hard to be that unwell and to not have anybody that you feel you can talk to or to guide you in terms of like medication and treatment. I didn't have anyone I could go to.
So there was no one at all that was following you up, despite the fact you'd been under a section in the past and also had been admitted to a psychiatric hospital?
Yeah, nobody followed me up.
So then what happened? You lost more and more weight, I take it.
Yeah, I kind of battled for a couple of years, like losing weight, gaining weight on my own, and then things kind of got to a really low point one year where I took quite a big overdose, and then I ended up on a section 136 again.
And what was the mechanism by which that happened? How did you make contact with the police? How did anyone find out you'd taken an overdose?
Well, I'd been in bed for a month because I was so low in mood that I just didn't want to do anything, didn't want to see anyone. And I left the house and I went out, and I'd gone missing. Like, my mum didn't know where I was, people didn't know where I wasn't answering my phone. So my mum twigged that something had happened. So my mum phoned the police, and the police were searching for me and they found me.
How did they find you?
I'm not actually sure. They were just searching areas that they thought I might be in the local town.
Okay, and where were you?
I was in some public toilets.
What were you doing there?
I'd taken an overdose and I was like semi-conscious at the time. I'd been like in and out of consciousness.
This sounds like a very, very low moment, a very dark moment. I also understand that you've been trying to take your life several times around this time. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I just didn't know what else to do. I didn't feel like there was any help out there for me. I didn't think that my eating disorder could get better and I couldn't handle it, and I didn't know how I was going to live my life when my eating disorder was taking up every single moment. So it felt like my only option was to end my life, to end my eating disorder.
So you get admitted to another psychiatric hospital at this stage, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And again, you got placed, this time though, under a Section 2 of the Mental Health Act, which is like a 28-day section, is that right?
No, this time was voluntary. This was my last voluntary admission. But
Okay.
I was taken to a hospital in a different county, and then I was taken to my local hospital a few days later, and they told me that they needed my bed, and I was asked to leave. So I didn't get any treatment, even though I was in hospital about a week. I didn't really get any help. Um, so I battled on my own, and then I moved to Wales, and that was when my major relapse happened that ended up in a section 2.
And what's the administrative element of that? What do you remember of that? Were forms being filled out? Who interviewed you? What was the procedure by which you were placed under this section? I think this was a section 2 of the Mental Health Act, which is a 28-day section.
Yeah, that's right. I was on the ward as a voluntary patient, like for one night, and I was very unwell. I was quite psychotic. I was very underweight. I didn't engage in the help, and I was trying to leave the ward, and they didn't have any other choice but to section me under, I think it's a section 5, the nurses section.
Right.
And then they arranged for a mental health act assessment to take place. So it was like doctors and social workers came to assess my state of mind, and
Right.
they decided to detain me under a section 2.
What did that feel like when you were told that was happening?
I think at the time I was too unwell to really have an opinion on it. I didn't really let it bother me because I just wanted to die, and I thought that it didn't matter where I was, that I could do it on the ward and that would be fine. And that was my attitude because I was very unwell. It didn't bother me.
Right. When they were assessing you, what sort of questions did they ask you? Can you remember?
Um, I'm not sure. I think it was about like how suicidal I felt and if I had any plans and if I felt safe to go home. I think it was those sort
And
of questions.
were you answering those questions truthfully?
I can't remember, to be honest.
Do you think you could have tricked them into letting you go?
I think I probably could have, but I think they can tell as well, not just by what you're saying, but by your behaviour as well as the words that are coming out of your mouth.
What was the treatment you then got on the ward?
They arranged for a dietitian to come and see me and an eating disorder specialist to come and see me. Yeah, I saw like various people who all inputted and they came up with a plan to gain the weight in hospital and change the meds to make my mood better. And they came up with a good aftercare package as well.
And so how long were you in hospital on this occasion?
I was in for 2 months.
It sounds like this is the first time you start to get proper treatment. Would you agree with that, or what's your view?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that if I would have been voluntary for that whole admission, I don't know as I would have got that help, which is quite worrying.
So there's something about being sectioned under the Mental Health Act which seems to ensure that you actually get help. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I feel like professionals took it seriously once I was sectioned because they had to provide some care package and tell my family that they had a care package, whereas as a voluntary patient I always felt like they were trying to discharge me rather than treat me.
So really, I mean, if I can put it this way, you must correct me if I'm wrong. You had, almost a decade really of getting iller and iller, and without really getting any proper help, despite the fact the signs were there for anyone to see that you were not well. But it takes this incident, a series almost of suicide attempts, and being placed under the section of the Mental Health Act before you really get help for the first time.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you think the help was good help, or could you improve it yourself if you thought it? Do you have any other thoughts about how the help could have been improved?
I think it was very good help, but the aftercare package didn't include a crisis plan, which I think is probably key in like mental health care. But also I was threatened with, if I didn't improve, I would have been tube fed and then sent to a secure unit. And that threat pushed me into recovery, but then I felt like I had to be perfect about it. So if I did struggle, I didn't feel like I could tell them that I was struggling. So I kind of pretended that I was doing better than I was some days as well.
Okay, but then you began to, although you were now an outpatient, you began to get unwell again. Is that right? This takes us to about the end of last year, 2014.
Yeah, that's right. So I was discharged and I did well for a few weeks, but I relapsed with my eating and I was on quite a lot of medication and I struggled with the side effects of the medication, and particularly as I wasn't eating enough, the sickness got quite bad, so I stopped taking the medication, and then it was just a downhill spiral almost back to where I began.
Were you being followed up as an outpatient, though? Was anyone keeping an eye on you?
Yeah, I had quite a good treatment team around me, but when I was saying, oh, I'm struggling to take my medications and I'm worrying about it, they didn't offer practical solutions. They were just like, well, when you manage to eat more, it won't feel like that. And that became quite difficult because I was struggling to eat more and I was struggling with the meds and I didn't really know what to do.
So you got worse and worse, and then what happened?
Um, I was I was contacting the crisis team, and they weren't particularly helpful. They were saying, "Oh, just call the police," and I didn't want to call the police. I wanted to speak to mental health professionals because I felt like if I worked with them, we could probably come up with a plan. But if I call the police, then I'm going to be sat waiting for an assessment with police officers, and that wasn't the right route for me. So they offered me an urgent appointment with the ward manager from there because the inpatient and outpatient are joined. And the ward manager wasn't particularly helpful. So he gave me some meds and sent me home and then told me to come back in the morning. And when I went back in the morning, I was really upset and I felt really suicidal. And I was sat in the room crying and he was saying to me, like home treatment need the room, so could I please leave? So I left the room and I went into the toilets to try and compose myself. And he came into the toilets and he told me that I need to leave because they need both cubicles. So I felt quite let down by mental health services and I felt like I was a waste of time and a waste of space. So I went down to the train station and I ended up on another section 136.
What were you doing at the train station? Was this another suicide attempt?
I was quite distressed, but I think I've learned along the way how much some of the things I do upsets my family. So I approached one of the police officers and I said that I didn't feel safe, and then they detained me.
Okay, so then what happened? You ended up back in a police cell?
And no, I didn't end up in a cell this time. They took me to a hospital and I waited for an assessment.
Were you admitted again?
Yeah, they asked me if I would go in as a voluntary patient, and I agreed. But I was discharged a few days later, and this was like just before Christmas. So on New Year's Eve, things reached a real low point, and I just felt like if I was going to die, I had to do it that night, and I just became convinced that it had to be that night. Um, and they asked me to go into hospital, and I refused, and I was detained in Section 2 again.
Tell us a bit more about that detention, because it sounds like that was quite a distressing moment as well.
Yeah, so I'd spoken to home treatment team and they'd asked me to go down for an assessment. And I wasn't going to go down because I didn't want to go into hospital, but I felt scared about what would happen if I didn't turn up. So I turned up to this assessment and I was really low, really wanting to hurt myself and end my life. And they said that they were going to detain me under a Section 2, and I actually ran out the building.
And what happened then?
The police were called and they came and found me, and they found me probably like 1 to 2 hours later. and then they took me back to the ward.
And so then you got admitted again to the ward?
Yeah, that's right. So I was on the ward for 2 or 3 weeks, and it did help. Like, I think I just needed a little bit of support to sort my eating out, sort my meds out, and yeah.
So did you get proper help then? And have you had proper help since then in terms of follow-up when you got discharged?
Yeah, when I got discharged, they gave me more of a solid treatment package. So I'm seeing the same people I was seeing before, but I'm seeing them more regularly. So there's always like, I always have at least 2 appointments a week with people. So there's a lot of support around me now.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think you've been on this journey where you're only now getting the right help, whereas you weren't for so many years before?
I think the services are quite pushed for money and for the time that they have. So I think that they do try and get away with the minimum that they can do because they are so pushed. They're pushed for beds, they're pushed for staff. So I think it took for those sections to happen for them to realise that actually I am quite unwell and I do need a lot of support.
What about this thing about being detained against your will in hospital? It's happened several times to you. It's one of those really scary things that people hear about, and it makes people really frightened of going to see a psychiatrist in the first place because they are worried about being sectioned under the Mental Health Act, being involuntarily committed to hospital. What are your thoughts about that process?
I think it is really scary to be detained, and I have felt quite ashamed of it, and it's made me, it's knocked my confidence a bit in social situations. I used to feel like I was less worthy than everyone else because I'd had this stuff happen to me. But I think it is rarer than people think it is to be detained. Like, if you go to see a psychiatrist, that's like a psychiatrist can't just detain you. You have to go through a mental health act assessment. And I don't think people are always clear on that process. I think they think that people can just say, I'm going to section you, and then you're sectioned, but it doesn't happen like that.
Tell us a bit more about the process from your standpoint. So what is that process? If a psychiatrist can't just section you, what actually has to happen?
Well, in my experience, it's been that a professional has become worried about me. So if we think back to like the detention last August, the home treatment team became worried about me. So they set up a mental health act assessment, but that assessment is with people that have never met you. It's like a blank slate. So they're not people that will know you from day to day, if that makes sense.
That's meant to be some kind of legal protection. Do you agree with that? Do you think that's a good idea? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it is a good idea because how I was 5 years ago is going to be very different to how I am now, and I wouldn't want the person who's got that choice, whether they detain me or not, to be looking at how I was 5 years ago, because things can change, things can get worse, and things can get better.
So the process involves 2 doctors and a social worker, at the very least, being involved in assessing you, and they ask you lots of questions. Is that your experience?
Yeah, that's my experience.
Do you think you could trick them if you didn't want to be detained? Do you think you could trick them by saying, giving the right kind of answers and therefore escape being sectioned under the Mental Health Act?
I think you could, but I think they don't just assess what you're talking about, they assess how you're behaving as well, because a mental health act assessment doesn't come out of the blue, it's there because somebody's concerned. So if you sit there and you say, oh yeah, I'm fine, I'm safe, I'm not sure that they would buy into that if you behaved in certain ways or your body language was a certain way.
People are also very afraid, and this is a recurrent theme in a lot of Hollywood movies, that a sane person, someone who is not unwell psychiatrically, can get sectioned for various reasons. It's quite easy to get sectioned. Do you think that's possible, that someone who's really very well, has no mental health problems at all, could get sectioned under the Mental Health Act, from your experience?
I suppose there's a chance, but I think it can be quite hard for unwell people to get help or to get even under the radar that they're not okay. So I don't think it'd be something that would be quite common to happen.
So do you think it's a good thing, there's a thing called the Mental Health Act, that when people become seriously unwell and lose insight and don't look after themselves or don't have the capacity to look after themselves, that the state intervenes and doctors and social workers can deprive people of their freedom temporarily under the Mental Health Act? Do you think that's a good thing, that there isn't legislation of that description on the statute books?
I do think it's a good thing, because I think without it last year I could have potentially died, and now I realise that life is a lot different. I feel very different about my life. I want to live it and I'm excited to live it. And I didn't feel like that before, but I do now. And people can appeal. If you think you've been sectioned wrongly, you've got the chance to appeal against it.
A lot of people will be very surprised to hear you say that you think it's a good thing there's such a thing as a Mental Health Act and that people can be detained against their will, given you've had some very unpleasant experiences. Could you explain that a bit more about why you think it's a good idea?
Because I think that there are times in people's lives when they do become very unwell, that they can't see any hope, and I didn't know particularly what was going on around me at one point, and if I would have been left to my own devices, I might have died at the age of 22. And because I was sectioned, although it was horrific and horrible and I wouldn't wish it on anyone, it saved my life. And I think sometimes horrible things are necessary if they've got a good outcome.
It may well have saved your life, and you've spoken very eloquently about that, but it also remains the case that things deteriorated really badly, way worse than they should ever have got, because the services haven't been very good for long periods of time, and you haven't been followed up, you haven't been given the right kind of help. And also I think that you had too many different kinds of therapists. You've not really had one person you could develop a relationship with who stayed and looked after you over a long period. What's your assessment of the standard of care you've received?
I think before I was sectioned, it was a very poor standard of care. I felt quite fobbed off by people, like people just didn't want to take things seriously, and people would say it was because, like when I moved, I was told, oh, it's because you've just moved house, despite all the years of illness. It could be quite hard to get listened to. And the care you do receive, there's a long waiting list, and then you're not seen often enough, but one appointment a month just isn't enough for somebody who's severely unwell. So it was appalling, and if that wouldn't have happened, if I would have got the care like that I'm receiving now, maybe I wouldn't have got to the point where I needed to be sectioned, because it would have been being treated and there would have been that hope that things can improve.
So let's talk about the various things that went wrong. One thing I think that went wrong was that you didn't receive a proper expert opinion that was continuous, that for many years you saw the same person who was an expert and looked after you, and you developed a long-term relationship. One of the things that's gone wrong, in my opinion, with the services, it's very fragmented, and people are divided into teams, and you don't see the same person more than once a lot of the time. But what do you think?
Yeah, definitely. It was, you'd do a few therapy sessions with one person, and then that would end, and then you'd be under a care coordinator, and the care coordinator would change or be off sick, and funding changed, and yeah, it was a lot of, like you say, fragmented care, and nothing was continuous. So I didn't have trust in the system, I didn't have trust in the people that I was seeing, and I didn't want to tell them the hardest things to say, because nothing was stable with it.
What about the expertise of the people that you saw? Did you have confidence in their expertise, or do you think you were seeing some people who really weren't trained in adequate enough depth to understand the complicated problems that you had?
Well, I've seen many people, and of all those people, I've only seen 3 professionals that are trained in eating disorders. So a lot of the time I did feel like they didn't understand what I was going through, and they would be asking me questions about what it was like to have my illness and what I thought would help, which isn't particularly helpful when you feel like you're teaching the professional about your illness because they weren't trained in eating disorders.
Another thing that I think people in your situation find very irritating is having to go over your history again and again all the time with new people, or even people who know you a little bit, but they don't know really basic facts. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. It just feels like you're always in that assessment process, and it's a bit like, oh, here we go again. And you feel like you're always talking about your life story, and there might be difficult parts in that, but nobody's actually helping you with any of it. You're just repeatedly telling people it.
What was your lowest moment, do you think, in all of this?
Um, I think it was probably last year, um, when I spent an entire, like the first night I spent in the psychiatric ward before I was sectioned. I spent the entire night awake with a plastic bag, like trying to take my life and making sure that nobody would catch me.
How were you trying to take your life with a plastic bag?
I was trying to suffocate myself, but it didn't work. Um, but yeah, I didn't think anything could get better. I didn't think being in the hospital would help. And I just felt horrific.
How come you were trying to do that on a ward? How come you weren't being supervised on a psychiatric ward?
Well, I was supposed to be on like level 2, which is 15-minute checks, so they walk in and look at you every 15 minutes. But at night, it didn't happen that night, so I think someone came in like 3 or 4 times through the whole night. But my bed was round the corner from the door, so they couldn't see my bed. So yeah, nobody could see what I was doing.
So it was entirely possible you could have killed yourself actually at that moment.
Yeah, I could have.
What do you think about that?
I think that's quite scary. I think that um, my family would have assumed that being on the ward that I was in safe hands, and it just wasn't safe that night.
So in a way, it's sheer chance that you're alive today, really.
Yeah, it is.
It's not really through active intervention from the mental health services.
No, they played their part, but um, not all of the time. So
What was the moment of the best help that you've had throughout this period?
I think it was so just after I'd been sectioned, and I think it was all on the same day. So I was on level 3 observations, which is where you have someone with you all the time, and they got all these professionals in to see me from all around the local area. So I saw like the eating disorder specialists and the dietitians and the psychiatrists, and they came up with a plan that was solid, and everybody in it knew exactly what they were doing, and they were trained in the illnesses. And I finally felt like I was in safe hands, like I trusted the people around me that they were going to help me get better.
So that kind of happened quite soon after your lowest moment in a way, is that right?
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
So almost the lowest moment led to that the services kind of finally twigged that something was seriously wrong.
Yeah.
But it just took them a long time for something really bad to happen before they twigged.
It did, and I think that's quite dangerous because I'm sure that there's probably many other people who got to that low point and they weren't as lucky as me and they didn't survive it.
So you've begun to talk out in this very helpful way about what happened to you, and you've connected with Mind, the mental health charity. Tell us a bit about that, about your relationship with Mind and what you're doing in speaking out about what happened to you.
Yeah, well, I'm really passionate about writing, so at first I was trying to write about my experiences and kind of overcome stigma and get rid of the stereotypes. And I got in contact with Mind about speaking out about my experience of the night in the cell, and I did that through my writing. I sent them an email, and that led on to my first piece of spoken media work. So I was speaking on the news, and it's just carried on. I think I find it's quite good to speak out about things, because the more you speak out, the more other people feel able to talk, and things change. Like, people don't know the problems, and unless you don't speak about it, nobody's going to know what's wrong with the services and what's wrong with mental health care.
And what's your view of the future now? You've become much more optimistic about the future.
Yeah, definitely. I think it sounds really cliche, but I think everything kind of happens for a reason. And all the stuff that happened to me, I'm trying to use it in a positive way now to improve lives for other people. And I find enjoyment in my writing and in blogging, and I feel much more positive about life and much more up for the future now.
Tell us a bit more about eating and your relationship with food now.
It's still very difficult. I wouldn't describe myself as recovered at all. I massively struggle with eating, but it doesn't rule my life. So I'm living a life alongside it and doing things alongside it, and food is just a small part of that.
There may be people listening to this who felt similarly to you, full of despair at the bleakest moments when you were full of despair. You're much more optimistic now. There may be people listening to this who are going through the kind of rough times you went through in the past. What would you say to them?
I think it's important just to hold on, because it does get better, and it might take 1 year, it might take 10 years, but it will get better, and you will want to live your life again. And I never thought that I would love my life. I never thought that that was possible, but now I can say that I love everything in my life and I wouldn't change a thing.
Claire Greaves, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.